Part 2 of Kierkegaard's The Present Age covers about 20 pages and takes us up through about the midpoint of the book. Kierkegaard here turns from his preliminary remarks to discussing what he calls the how of this age, and he notes that in the present age, our increased reflection has added to our affliction. We can associate this insight also with Rousseau's first discourse. The task for us in this part of the book, Kierkegaard says, is to learn to escape the temptation of reflection, which is capable of changing everything about our lives in an instant. There are, I think, 5 subsections to this part, dealing with reflective tension, envy, envy's product, ressentiment, and then the social form of leveling, and their final solution in Kierkegaard's philosophy of the individual. We'll tackle each of these in turn. On the question of reflective tension, Kierkegaard notes that while a passionate age tears down, a reflective age, like ours, leaves everything standing, but drains it of meaning. It is, to use a more contemporary metaphor, a kind of spiritual neutron bomb that kills everything alive, but leaves the buildings standing. So a kind of ambiguity creeps in to our social and spiritual life, and everything is then seen in shades of gray. The good and evil distinction, Kierkegaard says, is undermined both by a theoretical superior knowledge of evil among the sophisticated. This would be contrasted with a passionate embrace or disgust for evil, and also a kind of clever cynicism about the good and its association with naivete or stupidity. We might think here also of Nietzsche's later observation in Beyond Good and Evil, section 260. What characterizes this reflective tension, then, is a complete loss of inwardness in the present age. In the following pages, Kierkegaard gives examples of genuine relationships that have been replaced by a self-aware state of tension. So, for example, whereas of old an admirer might admire the greatness of someone above him, today he might observe the other as an equal. Where a subject might honor or condemn his king, now he is a kind of third-party observer of the king, and this ultimately may culminate in a kind of collective committee to evaluate the problem of kingship. Where a father might curse his son or a son defy his father, now they may meet to work out the problem, to make observations, to note each other's remarks. Where a student might formerly fear his schoolmaster and punishment, now there's a kind of indifference, or perhaps the schoolmaster and the student meet together to discuss the abstract problem of education in which they both find themselves. And with lovers, audacity and prurience may be replaced by a kind of triviality. What all of these have in common, Kierkegaard says, is a tension which exhausts life itself. There is a crucial passage, I think, here on pages 17 to 19 of this edition, beginning from the phrase, "what in fact," where Kierkegaard characterizes his thought more closely. I think this may be worthy of some sustained attention. The relationship continues, Kierkegaard says, but it has become meaningless. It has no power to unite its members. And this represents something of the insidious danger of reflection, which cannot be resisted directly because it's always able to adapt to our reaction to it. We might think that once we become self-aware, one can never become unself-aware. We simply add layers and layers of self-awareness. And so he writes, the established order of things continues to exist, but it is its ambiguity which satisfies our reflective and passionless age. So rather than seeing ambiguity as a kind of regrettable side effect of the real, we see now the ambiguity is precisely the thing that we delight in. We're thankful that the established order is ambiguous because our reflective mind finds a kind of pleasure in that. As a further example, we might consider a case in which Christian terminology, for example, the concept of sin, is kept, but it lacks the power of decisive thought. It lacks the power to actually motivate any action. This reflective tension, Kierkegaard says, then becomes the unifying principle of the present age, which is envy. Whereas enthusiasm was the unifying principle of the former passionate age. For our passionless age, the principle is envy. And envy has several effects, both individual and social. At the level of the individual, envy prevents passionate decision and action. And even for the person who can escape this and begin to act and decide passionately, the social level of envy traps the individual who escapes in a kind of collective envy and reflection. And the only escape from this second imprisonment, Kierkegaard says, is the inwardness of religion. And here we see a common theme in Kierkegaard that religiosity is going to involve the ultimate interiority of the individual. So one prompt I might add here is that we be on the lookout for whether this new inwardness could be the source of a future sociability. If we leave behind the sociability of the crowd and of the social trap of envy, on what basis do we re-enter social life later on for Kierkegaard? Social envy develops eventually into a kind of ressentiment, and Kierkegaard here uses the same French word that Nietzsche will later use, the word for resentment. He notes that in past ages, a healthy mockery of one's superiors did not preclude our continuing to admire them. So, for example, the Greek institution of ostracism was a negative mark of distinction because only excellent men were banished. It was something of an honor to be singled out for ostracism. But when reflection and indolence come to dominate our culture, this healthy outlet for ressentiment disappears, and it turns cowardly and vacillating. Kierkegaard says that ressentiment without a strong character can neither recognize nor understand true human excellence. So rather than honor it negatively, it tears it down and belittles whatever it finds to be higher than itself. This takes the cultural form, then, of leveling. An interesting project for students may be to compare Kierkegaard's views on ressentiment with Nietzsche's, and to ask whether Nietzsche is employing the same concept or one that is different in some crucial ways. On the topic of leveling, Kierkegaard tells us that a passionate age will build and tear down with enthusiasm, but a reflective or ironic age, like our own, stifles all action. This is what leveling is, a kind of paralysis. He calls it the abstract occupation which shuns upheavals. Rebellion, for example, the ultimate upheaval, is like the drowning roar of a volcanic eruption, which drowns out all other sounds. But leveling, he says, is the deathly silence in which one can hear one's own heart beating. It is a kind of paralysis of all action. Leveling is also an anonymous crowd action. There are no leaders possible in leveling. To become a leader is to violate the principle of leveling, is to stand out from the crowd. And so leveling, he says, is the victory of abstraction over the individual. It is in some ways the mistaken fulfillment of the modern ideal of equality. He calls it the negative unity of negative reciprocity of individuals. Leveling also involves a shift from outstanding individuals, as in the past, to the individual taken as an equal member of the mass. And so it is difficult or impossible for an individual to separate himself from his identity as part of the mass. Even as he does great things, he is unable to escape his identification with the equality of all members of the mass man. And this, of course, conflicts with the demand of religion, which is the single individual's relationship with God. Kierkegaard writes, leveling is, by its very nature, the destruction of the individual. He also calls it the self-combustion of the human race, which will consume everything. And so, in this Kierkegaardian turn, the only solution for leveling is the religious isolation of the individual. In the final pages of this part, Kierkegaard gives us more about the individual, and these pages are worth reading several times. He says the reality of religion requires the individual to be immersed in leveling and then to emerge from it. There is no escaping leveling except by going through it. And so the greatest individual is not going to emerge as a hero from leveling. Leveling will in fact consume him totally. Leveling levels everything. But in grasping the true meaning of leveling, the great individual will become a mere man, equal to all the others. He escapes from reflection in the equality of all mere men before God. And so religion, for Kierkegaard, uses reflection, abstraction, and modern equality to produce a real man, sort of on the far side of this social leveling in relationship to God. Reflection is a worldly snare, but it makes possible this individual leap to the eternal, because reflection has no power in the realm of eternity. This brings us to the end of what I'm calling Part 2 of The Present Age, halfway through the book. We'll turn to Part 3 next. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.